Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Our today's topic is ventricular system of the brain. It's special reference to the third ventricle. As you see, this is the human brain, which is composed of three parts: the prosencephalon or the forebrain, the mesencephalon or the midbrain, and rhomencephalon or the hindbrain. The prosencephalon comprising of the cerebrum and the diencephalon. You see, this is the prosencephalon, cerebrum, and this is the diencephalon. Each encloses a cavity. The cerebrum encloses the lateral ventricle. Can you see this is the lateral ventricle? So this is the lateral ventricle here. The cerebral hemisphere. Each cerebral hemisphere we have two lateral ventricles, and we have the. You can see this is the brainstem here. We have brainstem. This is a part of the cerebrum, and here we have the diencephalon. This is the midbrain. Posteriorly, you can see the brainstem. So spinal cord, medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain. These are the four colliculi, and this here is the diencephalon. So the cavity of the, you can see anteriorly here is the pons, and above it we have the midbrain, and above the midbrain we have the diencephalon. So I will open this part here. You can see these are the two parts of the diencephalon. They get so two parts of the diencephalon, and in between it encloses the cavity what we call as third ventricle. So coming to the, let me share my screen. So today's topic, the ventricular system of the brain in reference to the third ventricle. Learning objectives of the today's class are: after the class you should have an overview of the ventricles of the brain. You should be able to describe the third ventricle, describe the choroid plexus, and discuss the clinical aspects of the ventricles. This is a diagrammatic representation of the central nervous system. These are the two lateral ventricles. This is the third ventricle, and this is the fourth ventricle. And downwards we have the spinal canal. So what is the ventricular system? Ventricular system is a communicating system of cavities within the central nervous system. These cavities are lined by ependymal cells, which secrete the CSF. The ventricles store the CSF and also circulate the CSF. So ventricular system are the intercommunicating cavities of the central nervous system, lined by ependymal cells, which secrete the CSF. The ventricles store and circulate the CSF. So how many cavities we have in the central nervous system, what we call as the ventricles? You can see we have there, in each cerebral hemisphere, we have a lateral ventricle. Then in the diencephalon, we have a single third ventricle. And then in the hindbrain, we have the fourth ventricle. This fourth ventricle goes down as a spinal canal. And at the lower end of the spinal canal, we have another ventricle, what we call as terminal ventricle. Embryologically, you see, we have three parts of the brain. We have prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhomencephalon. The cavity of the prosencephalon is the lateral ventricle and third ventricle. The lateral ventricle being the cavity of the telencephalon, forebrain, and diencephalon, we have the third ventricle. The cavity of the mesencephalon is the duct of Sylvius or cerebral aqueduct, whereas the Cavity of the Roman cephalon we have as the fourth ventricle. The cavity of the spinal cord is the spinal canal, which at the lower end form the terminal ventricle. So these ventricles are interconnected with one another by channels, what we call as interventricular foramen of Monro, duct of Salvius or cerebral aqueduct, and the central canal of the spinal cord. You can see each of the two lateral ventricles of the two sides, they are connected with the third ventricle by interventricular foramen of Monro. Then this third ventricle, it is connected with the fourth ventricle by cerebral aqueduct, or what is also called as duct of Salvius. The fourth ventricle communicates with the central canal of the spinal cord. At the lower end of this central canal, there is dilatation, what is called as terminal ventricle. In addition, the fourth ventricle has communication with the subarachnoid space. As you know, the roof of the third ventricle has three openings. One is the foramen magendae in the median plane, and on its lateral aspects, there are two lateral foramina, what we call a foramina of Luschka. Through these foramina, the ventricular system communicates with the subarachnoid space. As you know, the subarachnoid space is below the arachnoid matter and above the pia matter. So there is all over the subarachnoid space, but at the base of the brain, this arachnoid space, subarachnoid space, it forms dilatation because of irregularity of the brain, and where the subarachnoid matter is not uniformly covering the brain. Those dilatations we call as subarachnoid cisterns. So what are subarachnoid cisterns? At some areas around the base of the brain, the arachnoid matter does not follow the surface of brain. Hence forms some spaces called subarachnoid cisterns, which also contain CSF. These include cerebellomedullary cistern or cisterna cerebellomedullaris, pontine cistern or cisterna pontis, interpeduncular cistern or cisterna interpedunculoris. So these cisterns, they are dilatations which contain the cerebrospinal fluid. So you can see this is the duct of Salvius communicating third ventricle with the fourth ventricle, and the fourth ventricle goes downwards as a spinal canal. Here we have the cerebellomedullary cistern. Similarly, here we have the pontine cistern. Fourth ventricle, as you know, is a tent-shaped cavity stretched anterior to the cerebellum and posterior to the pons and the medulla. The fourth ventricle possesses two lateral boundaries on either side, a roof, and a rhomboid-shaped fossa. So this is the rhomboid fossa or the floor of the fourth ventricle. There are what we call a recesses of the fourth ventricle. So what are these recesses? These recesses are pouch-like outpouchings or protrusions of the fourth ventricle. There are lateral recesses, median dorsal recess, and two lateral dorsal recesses. The lateral recess is present below the lateral angle and lies dorsal to the inferior cerebellar peduncle and ventral to the flocculus. It is lateral and has a foramen of Luschka. Median dorsal recess lies in the midline and extends into the central white matter of the cerebellum, between the lingula and the nodule. The two dorsal lateral recesses project dorsally above the inferior medullary velum. So these are the recesses of the fourth ventricle. So these are the two lateral recesses. This is the median single recess, and these are the two lateral dorsal recesses. So two lateral recesses, one single median dorsal recess, and two lateral dorsal recesses. So this is again the sagittal section of the brain, showing different structures. The cerebrum. This part here is the diencephalon. This is here the midbrain. This is the pons and this is the medulla. Coming to the lateral ventricle, so there are two lateral ventricles on the two cerebral hemispheres. Again, you can see the cavity of the lateral ventricle. So each lateral ventricle is roughly C-shaped and has three parts: main body, from which arise the three pouchings, or what you call as horns. Anterior horn going to the frontal lobe, posterior horn going to the occipital lobe, and inferior horn going to the temporal lobe. Then we have third ventricle. To understand the boundaries of the third ventricle, you should be able to know diencephalon. So as you know, we have prosencephalon, which comprise of telencephalon and diencephalon. The cavity of the telencephalon is lateral ventricle, whereas cavity of the diencephalon is third ventricle. You can see this is the third ventricle, and around structures around it, they constitute the diencephalon. So what is diencephalon? Diencephalon consists of third ventricle and the structures that form its boundaries. So third ventricle and its boundaries, they constitute the diencephalon. This diencephalon is a midline structure. It is a midline structure consisting of two symmetrical halves. And in between the two symmetrical halves, there lies this slit-like structure, what we call as third ventricle. It has inferior, superior, and medial and lateral borders. Diencephalon has inferior surface, superior surface, medial surface, and this is lateral surface. Inferior surface of the diencephalon as a whole is formed by hypothalamic and other structures, which include from anterior to posterior the optic chiasma, the infundibulum, the tuberosinium, and the two mammillary bodies. So these are the structures which are actually formed by the hypothalamus. Superior surface. So you can see this is superior surface of the diencephalon. It is concealed by the fornix. Superior wall of the diencephalon is formed by the roof of the third ventricle. So we have here the third ventricle. Its roof is formed by the diencephalon inferior surface. Superior surface of the diencephalon is formed by the roof of the third ventricle. You can see this is the roof of the third ventricle. This is fornix and this is corpus callosum. Lateral surface of the thalamus, lateral surface of the diencephalon is bounded by the internal capsule. This internal capsule, a band of white fibers which connects cerebral hemisphere with other parts of the central nervous system. The medial wall, see this is the medial wall of the diencephalon. It is actually the lateral wall of the third ventricle. Medial surface of the thalamus and is formed by medial surface of the thalamus and medial surface of the hypothalamus. In between the two, there is hypothalamic sulcus. So this diencephalon is divisible into parts: thalamus, subthalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus. Its main two parts are thalamus and hypothalamus, which have been taught in previous lectures. So you can see this is the thalamus here, and these are the hypothalamic structures here. So thalamus is a large ovoid mass of gray matter, which is of very great significance as it is a junction or cell stimulus receive here, synapse here, all the sensory input synapse here, except for the olfaction. So the functions of the cerebral cortex are closely related to the sensory cortex of the cerebrum. All sensations which come from the body, they have to pass through this thalamus, and then they go to the cerebral cortex. So if there is a damage to the thalamus, the sensory input to the cerebral cortex is interrupted. This means the cerebrum, though functionally viable, will not be functioning properly because it does not receive the stimulus from the thalamus. Only the olfactory sense that goes directly to the forebrain, that does not pass to the thalamus. You can see this is the thalamus. These are the hypothalamic structures. And there you can see this is the hypothalamic sulcus. Hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is the part of the diencephalon that extends from the optic chiasma to the mammary body. So up to this is a mammary body. These are two mammary bodies. Is the optic chiasma. So from here, this odd structure, it is the hypothalamus. Lies below the thalamus and form the floor and lateral walls of the third ventricle. Anterior to the hypothalamus is an area referred to as the preoptic area. So the hypothalamus contains from anterior to posterior the optic chiasma, the tuber cinereum, the infundibulum, and the mammary bodies. Now coming to the third ventricle. So you can see these are the two lateral ventricles, and between here we have the third ventricle. Third ventricle here on the lateral surface. This third ventricle is derived from the forebrain vesicle. It is a slit-like cleft between the two thalami. So one thalamus and another thalamus is the horizontal section passing to the thalamus. It communicates superiorly with the lateral ventricle through interventricular foramen Monro and posteriorly with the fourth ventricle. The third ventricle has anterior wall, posterior wall, lateral wall, superior wall, and inferior wall. So anterior wall. So again, this is the lateral ventricle over the surface of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. This is the anterior wall. It is formed by a thin sheet of gray matter called as lamina terminalis, across which runs the anterior commissure. So we have the anterior commissure here and lamina terminalis form the anterior wall of the third ventricle. Posterior wall, see this is a posterior wall, is formed by here by the opening of the cerebral aqueduct. Superior to it, with this opening is the posterior commissure. Is the posterior commissure. You can see the posterior commissure here. And then above it is the pineal recess, which projects in the stalk of the pineal gland, and habenular commissure. So habenular commissure, pineal recess, posterior commissure, and cerebral aqueduct. These structures constitute the posterior wall of the third ventricle. Lateral wall. So this is the lateral wall. What you are seeing here is the thalamus, interthalamic sulcus, hypothalamic sulcus, and the hypothalamus. So over this lies the third ventricle. So lateral wall is formed by the medial surface of the thalamus superiorly and hypothalamus inferiorly. And there is hypothalamic sulcus. You can see there this center part, this is called as interthalamic adhesion or connection, which connects the two thalami or the two sides. Roof. The roof of the third ventricle, you can see this is the third ventricle, and you can see it as roof, is continuous with the lining of the ventricle, ependymal lining of the ventricle. There we have the two-layered fold of pia matter, which is vascularized and is called as choroid. Superior to it, there is this fornix, body of the fornix, and above it we have the corpus callosum. So we have the choroid, fornix, and corpus callosum. Here we have the interventricular foramina Monroe, which communicates with the lateral ventricle. The floor of the third ventricle is formed by the hypothalamic structures. As I told you, they include the optic chiasma, the tuber cinereum, the infundibulum with its funnel-shaped recess and mammillary bodies. Posteriorly, there is also the tegmentum of the midbrain. You can see the tegmentum of the midbrain is interposed. So, in brief, the roof is constituted by fornicus, choroid, floor by the hypothalamic structures, laterally there is thalamus and hypothalamus, anteriorly lamina terminalis, and posteriorly opening into the cerebral tract, posterior commissure, pineal recess, and habeneural commissure. So, in each of the ventricles, there is what we call as choroid plexus. So, what is the choroid plexus? As you know, the ventricles are lined by ependyma, and brain surface is covered by meninges. Innermost layer of the meninges is the pia mater that goes and invades the ventricles also. So in the ventricles there is layer of the pia mater and ependymal layer. In between these there is capillary plexus. This together constitutes the choroid. Then this choroid forms a mesh-like structure in the ventricles, what is called as choroid plexus. Choroid means web. So it's a web-like structure which is present in the ventricles. So there is a choroid plexus in each of the ventricles of the brain. In the lateral ventricle, it is present only in the inferior horn. Choroid plexus is also located in the interventricular foramina, and from this interventricular foramina, it goes into the third ventricle at its roof. Choroid plexus in the fourth ventricle lies beneath the cerebellum. That is beneath the cerebellum and superior and inferior medullary vellum. You can see this is the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle, and it goes to the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle and forms the roof of the third ventricle. Clinical implications of the ventricles. What is papilledema? As we know, the cranial nerves emerge from the brain. These cranial nerves are axons of the neurons. Typical of these nerves is the optic nerve, which when it exits from the brain substance, it takes along with it all the three layers of the meninges, dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. So it also takes along with the subarachnoid space. In the subarachnoid space, there lies the cerebrospinal fluid. So that cerebrospinal fluid goes up to the eyeball along with the subarachnoid space. If there is rise of cerebrospinal pressure caused by intracranial tumor or any other disease condition, it will compress the thin walls of the retinal veins as it crosses the extension of the subarachnoid space to enter the optic nerve. This will result in congestion of the retinal veins, bulging forward of the optic disc, and edema of the disc. The last condition is known as papilledema. So papilledema is the bulging of the optic disc. And if you see how an ophthalmologist sees it, so this is the ophthalmoscope. The surgeon visualizes your eye through the cornea and he sees what lies inside. He focuses on the optic disc and around the retina. And this is the appearance of the normal optic disc and retina. But if there is raised intracranial pressure, the CSF, because of raised intracranial pressure, the optic disc is pushed forwards into the eyeball, in the vitreous of the eyeball. And the surgeon sees the optic disc like this. Compare this optic disc with this normal. So this is what is called as papilledema. This is called as papilledema due to raised intracranial pressure. There is also another condition what we call as hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus is an abnormal increase in the volume of the cerebrospinal fluid within the skull, which can be of any cause, maybe because of the obstruction in the passage of the cerebrospinal fluid, if any of the channels are blocked, or if there is increased secretion of the cerebral fluid, or there is decreased absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid. And what happens if it is before the birth? The skull being the soft that time, the skull enlarges. The skull enlarged to accommodate the fluid, and it reaches in the lower size of the head of the neonate, what we call as the hydrocephalus. If there is hydrocephalus in adults, because there is already bones have grown and they have united, ossification is complete, then that time there is raised intracranial pressure. It will cause pressure symptoms over the brain, and patient will suffer because of different types of symptoms, and it can cause damage to the brain tissue. So then the two papilledema and hydrocephalus should be able to understand what are the. Thank you.